Mexico has seen some of the darkest crimes in history, and many of them weren't committed by men. From cult leaders who demanded human sacrifices to serial killers who preyed on the vulnerable. These women left an entire nation stunned. Which country are you from, and which country should we do next? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into true crime from around the world, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Las Poquianchis, Delfina and Maria de Jesus Gonzalez Valenzuela, plus sisters. In January 1964, police in the quiet town of San Francisco del Rincón, Guanajuato, entered a property that locals had whispered about for years. The building looked unremarkable, just another brothel along the dusty road. But behind the walls, investigators uncovered something far worse than anyone imagined. Dozens of bodies buried in shallow graves, some reduced to bones, others still identifiable. It was the end of an empire built on cruelty and the beginning of Mexico's most horrifying criminal revelation, the story of the Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters, better known as Las Poquianchis. Delfina and Maria de Jesus Gonzalez Valenzuela did not look like predators. To their neighbors, they were businesswomen, hard, serious, but respectable. They owned several properties in Jalisco and Guanajuato. Their younger sisters, Carmen and Luisa, kept lower profiles. Together they ran what appeared to be legitimate establishments, catering to men who came to drink, gamble, and pay for companionship. Outwardly, they were part of a culture where such businesses were common and rarely questioned. But behind the closed doors of their empire, the sisters had created a system of exploitation so brutal it would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Most of the victims were young women, many still in their teens. They came from poor villages, drawn by newspaper ads or whispered promises of jobs as maids or waitresses. Families allowed their daughters to leave, believing they were securing a better future. But once inside, there was no escape. The Gonzalez Valenzuela sisters stripped them of their identities. They were given new names, new rules, and new debts they could never repay. The sisters also had a chilling hierarchy. Delfina, the eldest, was the strategist, the one who calculated profits and ordered punishments. Maria de Jesus was charismatic but volatile, often the one to enforce discipline. Carmen, though quieter, handled recruitment. And Luisa, the youngest, drifted in and out of the operations, increasingly unstable as the years went on. The system ran for over a decade. Women who became ill or resisted were beaten. Those who tried to escape were made examples of, subjected to violence so severe that others wouldn't dare follow. Pregnancies were not tolerated. Infants were sometimes abandoned, sometimes worse. The cycle was designed to erase hope. The sisters thrived on their control. They bribed local officials to look the other way, and even developed connections with police, ensuring no one investigated too deeply. For years they succeeded, their brothels expanded, and their wealth grew. But in 1963, cracks began to appear. A young woman managed to escape and report what she had seen. Her testimony described women chained to beds, bodies buried in courtyards, and armed men guarding the entrances. At first, authorities dismissed her claims as exaggeration, until multiple disappearances began linking back to the sisters' properties. When the raid finally happened in early 1964, investigators came expecting a handful of victims. What they found was a mass grave. The bodies were in various stages of decay, some still dressed in the clothing they'd worn when they arrived. Others were so decomposed that identification became impossible. Witnesses among the surviving women told stories that painted a picture of organized cruelty, punishments carried out not in rage, but with cold calculation. Estimates of how many lives were taken vary widely. Officially, the sisters were convicted for about 90 murders, but some reports suggest the true number could have been more than 200. The exact figure may never be known. Why did they do it? On paper, the motive was profit. Their brothels made significant money, and eliminating those who couldn't work kept costs down. But surviving accounts suggest something deeper. Delfina, who often kept meticulous records of earnings, seemed detached from the human suffering around her, as though the women were inventory. Maria de Jesus was different, impulsive, erratic, occasionally referring to herself as a mother of the house, even as she ordered brutal punishments. Carmen reportedly believed she was saving the girls by giving them work, a warped justification that collapsed when the truth came out. And Luisa, already fragile, descended into delusion, mumbling prayers while surrounded by the evidence of their crimes. It wasn't just greed. It was a complete corrosion of empathy, a transformation of human beings into commodities, and then into disposable objects. Their trial drew nationwide attention. People packed courtrooms to see the women whose names had become synonymous with evil. The sisters sat mostly silent as survivors recounted what had happened. Photographs of the graves appeared in newspapers across Mexico, igniting public outrage and forcing a reckoning with how such a network could operate in plain sight. The sentences were severe. Delfina and Maria de Jesus received 40 years each, the maximum allowed under Mexican law at the time. Carmen was sentenced as an accomplice. Luisa was declared mentally unfit and sent to a psychiatric facility. But even their punishments carried strange twists of fate. Delfina, the calculating leader, died in 1968 when construction workers accidentally dumped a load of cement on her cell. Carmen succumbed to cancer in prison. Luisa never recovered her sanity and died in an institution. Maria de Jesus served her sentence, was released in 1998, and disappeared into obscurity. Today, the name Las Poquianches still carries weight in Mexico, a shorthand for corruption, brutality, and the exploitation of the vulnerable. Their story is not just about four sisters. It's about how poverty and power can intersect to create systems that devour those who have no protection. As investigators left the property in 1964, one officer reportedly said, "You can clear the graves, but you cannot clear the air here." That sentiment lingers. The crimes of Las Poquianches remind us that behind statistics and headlines are real people whose voices were taken, whose futures were erased. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: how many others, in places still hidden, live under similar shadows, waiting for someone to see them before it's too late? Felicitas Sanchez Aon, the Ogress of Colonia Roma, April 1941. In the heart of Mexico City's Colonia Roma, a neighborhood known for its charm and ambition, a modest apartment on Salamanca Street became the center of a discovery so disturbing that even hardened investigators hesitated before entering. Neighbors had complained of a pungent smell, sweet, chemical, and unmistakably wrong. When police finally forced their way inside, they found not only the tools of a nurse's trade, but also small bones wrapped in paper, jars containing strange substances, and the remnants of what had once been infants. It was here that Felicitas Sanchez Aon, a trusted nurse and midwife, had built her empire of death. Felicitas did not fit the image of a killer. Born in Veracruz in 1890, she was intelligent, ambitious, and professionally trained, a rare achievement for women of her time. She moved to Mexico City, where she established herself as a nurse and midwife, the kind of person people turned to during their most vulnerable moments. Patients described her as calm, efficient, even maternal. To the families she worked with, she was someone who brought life into the world. But behind that public image, Felicitas was quietly building another identity, one rooted in commerce rather than care. Her victims were among the most defenseless, infants born into circumstances of poverty and desperation. In the 1930s, Mexico City was expanding rapidly. Opportunities drew people from rural areas, but with opportunity came hardship. Many single mothers, unable to raise a child, sought help from women like Felicitas. She offered solutions: temporary care, adoptions, or, if the mothers insisted, discreet terminations. At first, her work seemed like a grim but necessary service. She placed babies with families willing to pay for adoptions, often forging paperwork to make the arrangements appear legitimate. But soon the pattern darkened. Infants who weren't marketable, those who were sickly, disfigured, or whose adoptions fell through, began to vanish. By 1938, neighbors started to notice unusual activity around her apartment. A steady stream of women entered visibly pregnant and left empty-handed. There were frequent deliveries of kerosene and lime, and the smell of burning became part of the neighborhood's background. Complaints to authorities went nowhere. Felicitas was, after all, a professional, a nurse in good standing, and police rarely questioned people of her status. Her methods were systematic. Investigators later discovered she used poisons, strangulation, and even incineration to dispose of the infants. Some bodies were dismembered before being burned, their remains mixed with trash or buried in courtyards. By the time authorities pieced together her actions, estimates suggested she had taken the lives of at least 40 children, though some believed the number could be higher. The discovery in April 1941 was almost accidental. A plumber working on a drainage issue near her building found small bones clogging the pipes. He alerted police, who traced the blockage back to her apartment. Inside, officers found ledgers listing infants by description, weight, and cost. Some names had check marks beside them, others a single line drawn through. Among the evidence were jars containing preserved organs and notes detailing mixtures of chemicals she used for injections. These were not the chaotic acts of someone overwhelmed by circumstance. They were the calculated steps of a woman who had transformed her medical training into a business model. Felicitas's motive, on the surface, was profit. Healthy infants could fetch high sums from families seeking children, particularly those unable to conceive. Those who couldn't be sold were, in her view, liabilities, mouths to feed, risks to her operation. But surviving accounts from her acquaintances suggest there was more to her psychology. She was described as cold, detached, and disdainful of the mothers who came to her. Some said she spoke of the babies not as people but as products. Others noted her obsession with cleanliness and order, as if erasing the evidence of her crimes gave her a sense of control. Her own personal life may have influenced her worldview. Records indicate a troubled marriage marked by violence, and she had lost her own twins under unclear circumstances years earlier. Whether this loss hardened her or simply revealed who she already was remains unknown. When police arrested her, Felicitas remained eerily calm. Witnesses said she neither denied nor confessed. She simply asked if she could have her cigarettes. News of her crimes spread quickly, and the press gave her a name that captured public horror: La Ogresa de la Colonia Roma, the Ogress of Colonia Roma. Her trial was expected to be one of the most sensational in Mexican history, a chance to understand how someone entrusted with life could become its systematic destroyer. But the country never got that reckoning. Within weeks of her arrest, Felicitas took her own life in her cell, reportedly by ingesting poison. Her death left more questions than answers. How many infants had passed through her hands? How many families unknowingly adopted children whose siblings had been discarded? And how had she operated for so long without intervention? Even today, her case is rarely discussed outside true crime circles, perhaps because it forces an uncomfortable confrontation. Felicitas was not an outlaw hiding in shadows. She was a professional, woven into the fabric of her community, performing a role society valued. And yet, within that role, she found the space to build an industry of unthinkable cruelty. Standing outside her former apartment now, it's difficult to imagine what happened there. Colonia Roma has changed. It is vibrant, artistic, alive. But beneath that surface lies a reminder of what can happen when desperation meets opportunity, and when the very person entrusted to deliver hope decides instead to erase it. Juana Barraza Samperio, La Mataviejitas. On January 25, 2006, in a quiet Mexico City neighborhood, police arrived at the home of Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, an elderly woman who had been found lifeless on her living room floor. The cause was disturbingly clear: strangulation with a stethoscope. But what stunned investigators wasn't just the brutality, it was the sight of someone fleeing the scene. Witnesses had seen a woman, not a man, rushing away. Minutes later, police apprehended her. Her name was Juana Barraza Samperio. Until that moment, she had been just another face in the crowd. Within hours, she would be revealed as the person behind one of Mexico's most chilling series of crimes, La Mataviejitas, the little old lady killer. Juana Barraza did not fit the image that investigators expected. Born in 1957 in Hidalgo, she grew up in poverty, dreaming of becoming someone admired, someone strong. She eventually found her escape in the colorful world of lucha libre, Mexico's professional wrestling scene, performing under the name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. She wore glittering masks and played the role of the quiet but powerful fighter. Outside the ring, she was a mother of four, often described by neighbors as polite, even reserved. To those who knew her casually, Juana was just another working-class woman navigating the challenges of Mexico City. Few could have imagined that beneath her public image she carried a growing resentment that would erupt into violence. Her victims were among society's most vulnerable, elderly women living alone. Many were widows or retirees, respected members of their communities. They opened their doors to Juana because she didn't appear threatening. Often she posed as a nurse, a social worker, or a helper offering government aid, a believable cover in a city where programs for the elderly were common. Once in, the breakthrough came not through advanced profiling but by chance. On that January day in 2006, Juana struck again, targeting Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, but this time a neighbor saw her leaving the house and alerted police. Officers chased her through the streets and caught her within minutes. Inside her bag, they found items stolen from the victim's home, as well as identification cards from previous victims. When police raided her residence, the evidence was undeniable: clothing, trophies, and objects linked to multiple scenes. Confronted with the proof, Juana admitted to many of the killings, though she never gave a definitive number. Estimates suggest she took the lives of between 30 and 40 women over nearly a decade. Understanding why Juana did what she did proved more complex than counting her victims. Psychological evaluations revealed deep-seated trauma. As a child, she had endured severe abuse, including being traded by her alcoholic mother to an older man. Those experiences left her with lasting anger toward women she associated with neglect or betrayal. In interviews, Juana claimed she targeted elderly women because they reminded her of her mother. Yet her actions also suggested calculation. The thefts provided financial support, but witnesses described her demeanor during the attacks as almost detached, as though she was acting out a script rather than lashing out in rage. Her double life, as a performer celebrated for strength and a predator preying on the weak, symbolized a disturbing balance between control and chaos. She wanted power, but only found it in destruction. Juana's trial captivated the nation. In 2008, she was convicted on 16 counts of murder and 12 counts of robbery, though authorities believe she committed far more crimes. Her sentence was unprecedented: 759 years in prison. Under Mexican law, she will serve a maximum of 60 years, and effectively ensuring she will never be released. Throughout the proceedings, she remained composed, sometimes even smiling at reporters. When asked if she regretted her actions, she gave no clear answer. Her silence, once a performance in the wrestling ring, had become her defining trait in real life. Today, Juana Barraza lives in a women's prison outside Mexico City, reportedly spending her time making crafts to sell. Her story forces an uncomfortable reckoning. She was not a figure lurking in shadows, but someone who blended seamlessly into the rhythms of daily life. A neighbor, a performer, a mother. The crimes of La Mataviejitas shattered the sense of security for Mexico's elderly population, exposing how trust can be weaponized. They also revealed how deeply personal wounds can manifest as public tragedies when left unhealed. Standing at the intersection where she was arrested, the city feels unchanged, crowded, vibrant, indifferent. But for those who remember, the story lingers, a reminder that the face of violence is not always what we expect, and that behind every statistic is a human story, shaped by pain, choices, and consequences that ripple far beyond the moment of the crime. Magdalena Solis, the High Priestess of Blood. In May 1963, in the remote hills of Yerba Buena, Tamaulipas, police stumbled upon a scene that seemed torn from nightmare. They had come searching for missing villagers, ordinary men and women who had vanished without explanation. What they found instead were shallow graves, scattered bones, and remnants of ritual altars stained with blood. Standing at the center of this chaos was a name whispered by survivors: Magdalena Solis, the self-proclaimed High Priestess of Blood, whose brief reign turned a struggling farming community into a theater of horror. Magdalena Solis was not born into power. She grew up in Monterrey in the 1940s, the daughter of a poor family, largely anonymous to those around her. She worked menial jobs and, according to court records, spent time in sex work to survive. Outwardly, she seemed unremarkable, another young woman battling poverty in post-revolutionary Mexico. But those who later encountered her described something unsettling, a charisma that drew people in, paired with an intensity that made it hard to look away. She was ambitious, shrewd, and deeply aware of how to manipulate belief. These traits would shape her transformation from an ordinary woman into one of Mexico's most infamous cult leaders. Her victims were not random. They were residents of Yerba Buena, a poor and isolated village desperate for hope. For years, the community had endured hunger, illiteracy, and neglect from authorities. They wanted salvation, spiritual and material. That longing made them vulnerable. The story began when two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, arrived in the village claiming to be prophets of the Aztec gods. They promised wealth and power if the villagers followed them. Initially, they used simple tricks, faked rituals, promises of hidden treasures, to maintain control. But as doubts grew, they needed someone to cement their authority. That someone was Magdalena. Brought in under the guise of a divine messenger, she told the villagers she was the reincarnation of an Aztec goddess. Her beauty, commanding presence, and absolute certainty convinced them. Within weeks, she was no longer just assisting the Hernandez brothers, she was leading the movement. Under Magdalena's guidance, the cult's practices turned darker. Rituals that began with symbolic offerings escalated into blood sacrifices of animals. But soon, she demanded more. According to witness testimony, she told the villagers that only human blood could grant them the supernatural powers they sought. The first victims were dissenters, those who questioned her divinity. They were dragged to the altars, beaten, cut, and ultimately unalived as the others watched in terror. Magdalena's voice guided every step, assuring them that these acts were necessary, that they were purifying the community. Survivors later described nights lit by torches where Magdalena stood adorned in ceremonial garb, drinking from bowls of blood while chanting invocations. For many, the psychological grip she held was stronger than fear. She had convinced them that she alone could save them from ruin. The violence spiraled. Over several months, at least 8 villagers were killed in these rituals. Some sources suggest the number could have been as high as 15. Each death reinforced her control, erasing any remaining resistance. The cult might have continued unchecked if not for 2 outsiders, a pair of teenagers who accidentally stumbled into the village and witnessed one of the ceremonies. Horrified, they fled, but the cult pursued them. One was captured and killed, the other escaped and alerted authorities. When police entered Yerba Buena, they were met with armed resistance from the cult members, who believed they were defending sacred ground. It took days to secure the area. The villagers, many of them malnourished and traumatized, appeared dazed, as though waking from a collective nightmare. Magdalena and the Hernandez brothers were captured. The altars were dismantled, the graves uncovered, and the rituals documented in chilling detail. Understanding Magdalena's motives requires looking beyond the violence. On the surface, she sought power, material, sexual, and spiritual. Witnesses described how she demanded not only obedience, but also reverence, orchestrating ceremonies where she was treated as divine. Psychologists who later studied the case speculated that her actions reflected a combination of narcissistic and psychopathic traits, a belief in her own superiority paired with a complete lack of empathy. But others argued her rise was also circumstantial. Poverty, marginalization, and a lifetime of exploitation may have fueled her need to dominate rather than be dominated. The villagers, meanwhile, weren't simply victims of her cruelty. They were participants shaped by desperation.
Magdalena gave them a story to believe in, a story that justified their suffering and promised transcendence. In that sense, the cult was as much about collective delusion as it was about individual pathology. In court, Magdalena showed little emotion. She admitted to orchestrating the rituals, but framed them as acts of faith. Her testimony oscillated between grandiose declarations, calling herself a goddess,
and cold pragmatism, explaining how sacrifices kept followers obedient. She was convicted of 2 murders, the charges authorities could conclusively prove, and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The Hernandez brothers received similar sentences. The remaining villagers returned to a shattered community, left to rebuild under the weight of what they had done and endured. Magdalena served her sentence quietly. Little is known about her final years, though reports suggest she never expressed remorse. Today, Yerba Buena is like any other rural town, quiet, unassuming, trying to forget. But for those who know its history, the story of Magdalena Solis is a haunting reminder of how belief can be twisted into brutality. She was not a mythical figure, despite the title she claimed. She was a human being who understood how to turn fear into devotion and devotion into destruction. Her rise and fall illustrate a painful truth. When hope is scarce, even the most impossible promises can feel real. As one investigator later said, standing among the burned-out altars, the blood dries, the ground heals, but the memory doesn't leave. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Magdalena Solis, the realization that the capacity for darkness doesn't arrive from outside. It grows, slowly, in the spaces where people stop questioning and start believing in the wrong person. Sara Maria Aldrete, Lamadrina. On April 11, 1989, in the dusty outskirts of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, police dug into a ranch called Santa Elena. What they uncovered looked less like a crime scene and more like a battlefield between faith and horror. Shallow graves filled with mutilated bodies, ritual altars coated in wax and dried blood, and a blackened cauldron containing human remains. For weeks, people had whispered about disappearances near the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, the truth emerged. At the center of it all stood a woman the cult members called Lamadrina, the godmother. Her real name was Sara Maria Aldrete. Sara Aldrete did not resemble the figure of terror she would become. Born in Matamoros in 1964, she split her life between Mexico and Texas, living what seemed like an ordinary existence. She was tall, striking, and intelligent. At Texas Southmost College in Brownsville, she studied physical education, aspiring to become a teacher. Friends described her as disciplined, ambitious, even kind. She also had a fascination with spirituality. Folk religions and rituals intrigued her, though at the time this interest seemed harmless. By all accounts, she was the type of person you might trust instantly, a student who excelled in her studies and a neighbor who smiled as she passed by. But in 1987, that image began to fracture. Her connection to the victims was indirect, but devastating. Through a chance encounter, Sara met Adolfo Constanzo, a charismatic figure who claimed to be both a psychic and a practitioner of Palo Mayombe, an Afro-Cuban religion. Constanzo was more than a spiritual leader. He was also deeply embedded in the drug trade. To his followers, he promised invincibility through ritual, merging mysticism with power. Sara was drawn to him. He was magnetic, confident, and seemed to embody everything she admired about strength. Over time, she didn't just join his circle. She became his second-in-command, Lamadrina, the maternal face of the cult. She helped recruit members and reassured them of Constanzo's promises. The victims, mostly young men, came from 2 worlds: cartel rivals, targeted to cement the group's dominance, and unsuspecting individuals abducted for ritual sacrifice. To the cult, each victim was a means to an end, a sacrifice meant to fortify their supernatural protection. Between 1986 and 1989, Constanzo's group operated quietly, performing rituals in the shadows of the borderlands. At first, the ceremonies used animal offerings, but the ambition of the cult grew darker. Human sacrifices, they believed, would bring ultimate power, immunity from bullets, protection from law enforcement, and dominance over rival traffickers. Sarah's role was pivotal. She was the bridge between the outside world and the nightmare within. While Constanzo performed the killings, Sarah allegedly maintained order, calmed members' fears, and gave the rituals a sense of legitimacy by framing them as sacred acts rather than brutal crimes. The group's actions might have remained hidden longer if not for the disappearance of Mark Kilroy, a 21-year-old American student who vanished during spring break in March 1989. His case drew international attention, forcing authorities to intensify their search. The investigation led police to the Santa Elena Ranch, where they discovered the evidence of ritual killings. Among the remains was Kilroy's body, alongside at least 15 others. Each bore marks of mutilation, consistent with Palo Mayombe sacrifices, missing organs, severed limbs, and ritual burns. In the altar room, investigators found the nganga, a cauldron used in the religion. Inside were bones, blood, and animal remains, combined with objects like coins, sticks, and even human vertebrae. For the cult, this mixture symbolized power. For authorities, it revealed methodical brutality. As the net closed in, Constanzo ordered his followers to resist capture. He was killed in a shootout, reportedly by his own request, preferring death to imprisonment. Sarah, however, survived. She was arrested soon after, maintaining that she had been manipulated and feared for her life. Unraveling Sarah Aldrete's motives has long divided analysts. Was she a victim of Constanzo's charisma or an equal architect of the terror? Psychological evaluations suggested she was deeply susceptible to influence, but also capable of calculated control. She wasn't merely present. She helped systematize the cult's operations, organizing rituals and reassuring members that their acts were divinely sanctioned. Some survivors even claimed she exuded more authority than Constanzo during moments of crisis. Her own accounts paint a different picture. She described herself as trapped, seduced by a man who promised power, but delivered destruction. Yet, her writings from prison suggest a fascination with the ideology she once practiced, a hint that fear and belief may have coexisted within her. At its core, the case reflects a collision of forces. The volatility of narcotics trafficking, the seductive power of mysticism, and the ambition of individuals who believed they could transcend mortality through blood, say. Aldrete stood trial in 1990, facing charges that included multiple counts of murder, organized crime, and involvement in narcotics operations. The courtroom was packed, with journalists capturing her every move. Unlike Constanzo, who died defiant, Sarah appeared calm, even articulate. She insisted she was innocent of the killings, portraying herself as a frightened accomplice rather than a willing participant. The evidence told another story. Testimonies from cult members, physical evidence from the ranch, and her documented role in recruiting and maintaining the group's structure. She was sentenced to 45 years for the killings, and later received an additional 12 years for related crimes. Today, she serves her sentence in a Mexican prison, occasionally granting interviews where she alternates between expressions of regret and claims of spiritual awakening. The story of Lamadrina is not just about one woman. It's about how belief, ambition, and fear can intertwine until morality collapses. Sarah Aldrete began as a student with dreams of teaching. Somewhere along the way, those dreams warped into something unrecognizable, shaped by the promise of power and the charisma of a man who saw death as a tool. For the families of the victims, the memory of Santa Elena lingers, a place where lives were reduced to symbols, where ritual was used to justify cruelty. And for those who study her case, Sarah embodies a haunting paradox. The face of someone who could have lived an ordinary life, but instead chose to become the godmother of one of Mexico's darkest chapters. As one investigator said, standing among the graves at the ranch, the ground remembers what people try to forget. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Sarah Aldrete, that power built on suffering always leaves a mark, long after those who sought it are gone. Claudia Mihangos, the hyena of Querétaro. On May 25, 1989, the city of Querétaro woke to a nightmare. In a quiet middle-class neighborhood, Police entered the home of 33-year-old Claudia Mihangos, once known as a beauty queen, a religious teacher, and a loving mother. Inside, the scene was harrowing. Her 3 children, 6, 9, and 11 years old, were found lifeless, each stabbed multiple times. Claudia herself was barely conscious, bleeding from self-inflicted injuries. When officers tried to speak to her, she muttered something chilling. The devil was in the house. Before that day, Claudia was the picture of stability and grace. Born into a respected family in Mazatlan, she had grown up surrounded by privilege. She was intelligent, charismatic, and strikingly beautiful, earning the title of local beauty queen in her late teens. Later she married a successful businessman, moved to Querétaro, and became a mother of 3. She wasn't just admired for her looks. Claudia studied to become a catechism teacher, instructing children at her parish about morality and faith. To her neighbors, she was everything they expected a mother to be, devoted, nurturing, and elegant. But behind her carefully maintained image, a storm was building, one she didn't fully understand herself. Her children were the center of her life. Friends recalled how she rarely spoke of anything else. Her eldest son Alfredo was serious and protective of his younger siblings. Her daughter, Claudia Maria, was bright and curious, and her youngest, Ana Belén, was cheerful and playful, often clinging to her mother's side. But in the months leading up to the tragedy, Claudia began to change. She suffered from increasing paranoia, believing she was being followed and watched. She spoke of voices whispering at night, voices that alternated between divine and demonic. Her marriage was deteriorating, and she confided in friends that she felt overwhelmed, trapped between reality and what she described as a battle for her soul. The night before the killings, Claudia attended a dinner with friends. Witnesses later said she seemed distracted, almost dissociated. After returning home, she reportedly began pacing the house, speaking to herself, and calling her estranged husband repeatedly, insisting something terrible was coming. In the early hours of May 25th, Claudia claimed to see figures moving through her home. She believed a diabolical entity had taken control of her children, and that the only way to save them was through what she called a cleansing. She took a kitchen knife and attacked first her eldest son, Alfredo, as he slept. Her daughter, Claudia Maria, tried to intervene and fled to a neighbor's house but collapsed before reaching it. Ana Belén, the youngest, was found in the hallway. Claudia then turned the knife on herself, though her wounds were not fatal. When police arrived, guided by frantic calls from neighbors, Claudia was calm. She told them she had freed her children. The case shook Querétaro to its core. Reporters swarmed the city, dubbing her the hyena of Querétaro, a name that reduced her tragedy to something monstrous. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Claudia's actions weren't born from malice, but from untreated illness. Psychiatric evaluations revealed she was suffering from schizoaffective disorder, a condition combining psychosis with severe mood disturbances. She experienced hallucinations, delusions, and periods of mania that distorted her perception of reality. Her religious devotion shaped the content of her delusions. She believed she was in a battle between good and evil, and that her children's deaths were a necessary sacrifice. Neighbors admitted they had noticed changes in her behavior but never imagined the danger. Mental illness, especially among women of her social standing, was rarely acknowledged or treated in Mexico at the time. Claudia's motive was neither anger nor hatred. In her fractured mind, she believed she was protecting her children from something worse than death. This paradox, that love could manifest as violence, disturbed even seasoned investigators. Psychologists who studied her case described it as a perfect storm of factors: genetic predisposition to mental illness, the stress of a failing marriage, and social isolation. Claudia herself, once medicated and stabilized, reportedly expressed profound remorse. She claimed to remember fragments of that night, but said it felt like watching someone else move my hands. In 1990, Claudia was convicted on 3 counts of homicide and given the maximum sentence under Mexican law, 30 years. She served most of it in a psychiatric prison, where she was heavily medicated and underwent therapy for the first time. Over the decades, she became a different person, quiet, introspective, and deeply religious. Those who interacted with her Air in prison described her as gentle and lucid, though haunted by what she had done. In 2019, after completing her sentence, Claudia was not released into society. Instead, she was transferred to a psychiatric facility, deemed too fragile to live independently. Today, the house where it happened remains a grim landmark. Some say it is cursed, others avoid it altogether. But the story of Claudia Mihangos is less about curses and more about silence. The silence around mental illness, the silence of warning signs ignored, and the silence of a woman who never found the help she needed. Her case is often cited by mental health advocates in Mexico as a turning point, a reminder that tragedies like this are not born in an instant. They grow quietly, in the shadows of stigma and misunderstanding. As one psychiatrist who treated her said, Claudia was not a monster. She was a sick woman whose illness was stronger than her will. And perhaps that is what makes this story so haunting. It forces us to question how many others are walking the same fragile line, unseen and untreated, carrying storms inside that no one else can hear. Christina Solidad Sanchez Aon, Taxistas. On June 7, 2010, in Garcia, Nuevo León, police were called to a dirt road on the outskirts of town. A taxi sat abandoned, its engine still running, headlights casting weak beams into the darkness. Inside, the driver slumped against the steering wheel, lifeless with clear signs of violence. For investigators, this was the fifth similar case in just 2 months. Each scene followed the same pattern. Male taxi drivers, lured to isolated areas, unalived with precision, and left behind without their money or valuables taken. Locals began to whisper about a predator targeting drivers. What they didn't expect was that behind the string of killings was not a cartel, not a gang, but a woman, a 27-year-old named Christina Solidad Sanchez Aon. She would become known as La Taxistas, the taxi driver killer. Christina didn't fit the public's image of a serial offender. Born in Monterrey in 1983, she grew up in poverty but wasn't invisible. People described her as quiet, withdrawn, and hard-working. She held jobs in factories, and neighbors said she was polite, even soft-spoken. But beneath the surface, her life was marked by turmoil. Christina endured abuse throughout her childhood and adolescence, experiences that left deep psychological scars. By her early 20s, she carried herself with a detached calm that others mistook for resilience. She wasn't known to drink excessively, didn't use drugs, and had no prior criminal record. On paper, she seemed ordinary. But as later investigations revealed, years of trauma had begun to calcify into something darker, an anger that demanded an outlet. The victims had no personal connection to her. They were men doing their jobs, driving taxis to support their families. To Christina, however, they represented something larger. According to her confession, she believed men, especially those in positions of small authority, like taxi drivers, symbolized the powerlessness and humiliation she had suffered throughout her life. She claimed that years earlier, she had been sexually assaulted by a man in a similar profession, and the memory had never left her. Whether this account was fully true or partly rationalization remains debated, but to Christina, the killings were personal. Her choice of victims was deliberate. She selected drivers who worked alone at night, often in rural or poorly lit areas where help would be far away. Christina didn't act alone. She partnered with a man named Angel, whom she met through friends. Together, they developed a simple but effective strategy. Christina would hail a taxi, posing as an ordinary passenger. Once they reached an isolated stretch of road, Angel would emerge from hiding and the attack would begin. Unlike many crimes driven by financial desperation, these killings weren't motivated by robbery. In most cases, valuables were left untouched. The purpose was control, and for Christina, retribution. The killings escalated quickly. Between April and June 2010, at least 5 drivers were found dead, each killed in nearly identical circumstances. Investigators initially suspected organized crime, given Nuevo León's history of cartel violence. But something about the scenes didn't fit. There were no messages, no stolen goods, no cartel signatures. The turning point came after the sixth attempted killing. A driver, critically injured but still alive, managed to call for help and describe his attackers. His account shocked investigators. The ringleader, he said, was a woman. With this new lead, authorities began cross-referencing recent taxi pickups and passenger sightings. Surveillance footage eventually captured Christina entering a taxi on the night of one of the murders. On June 10th, police raided a small apartment in Garcia, arresting Christina and Angel. Inside, they found knives matching the wounds on the victims and clothing stained with blood. During interrogation, Christina was calm, almost detached. She admitted to the killings without hesitation, providing details only the perpetrators could know. What struck investigators most was her lack of remorse. When asked why she did it, she reportedly said, "They deserved it, all of them." Psychiatric evaluations painted a complex portrait. Christina was diagnosed with antisocial personality traits and possible post-traumatic stress disorder. Experts concluded that her actions were fueled by a mixture of personal trauma and pathological detachment. She described feeling powerful during the killings, claiming it was the first time in her life she hadn't felt like a victim. For her, each attack was not about the individual men, but about reclaiming control from the faceless figure of male authority she believed had oppressed her. Yet, despite her explanation, psychologists noted her ability to plan and execute the crimes suggested a level of intent that went beyond impulse. She wasn't acting in the grip of psychosis. She knew what she was doing, and she chose to keep going. In 2013, after a lengthy trial, Christina was convicted of 5 murders and 1 attempted murder. She received a sentence of 130 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Mexican law. Angel, her accomplice, received a similar sentence. In prison, Christina reportedly remained stoic. Journalists who managed to interview her described her as articulate and unnervingly calm. When asked if she regretted her actions, she said, "No, I only regret not stopping sooner." The story of La Taxistas forces a grim examination of how violence is born. Christina's life illustrates how trauma, left untreated and unacknowledged, can mutate into something unrecognizable. Her victims were innocent men, yet in her mind, they symbolized everything she believed had destroyed her. Nuevo León still remembers those months in 2010 with unease. For taxi drivers, each shift became a gamble. For their families, the fear lingered long after Christina's arrest. And for the public, her case challenged assumptions about who can commit such acts. She wasn't the stereotype of a killer. No prior arrests, no outward aggression, no visible signs of instability. She was someone who, to most people, would have passed unnoticed, a reminder that darkness often hides in plain sight. As one investigator later said, standing at the site of the first killing, "We thought we were looking for monsters. Instead, we found people. And that might be the scariest thing of all." Sylvia Morazz Moreno. On March 21, 2012, authorities in Nacozari de Garcia, a small mining town in Sonora, received a tip that would unravel one of the most disturbing cases in the region's history. A teenager, recently reported missing, had been linked to a house on the edge of town. When police arrived, the property looked ordinary, dusty, modest, and quiet. But beneath the floor, they found shallow graves. The bodies of 3 victims, each killed months apart, had been buried under the same roof. At the center of this discovery was Sylvia Morazz Moreno, a 44-year-old woman who had convinced her family that their killings were sacred offerings to Santa Muerte, the folk saint often associated with death. To outsiders, Sylvia appeared unremarkable. She was a mother of 6, a grandmother, and the head of a sprawling household. She sold snacks and basic goods to neighbors, occasionally read tarot cards, and participated in local festivals. Those who knew her described her as commanding but approachable, someone who enjoyed being seen as spiritual and wise. But inside her home, Sylvia nurtured a different identity. She was obsessed with Santa Muerte, the skeletal figure venerated by some as a protector and punisher. While devotion to Santa Muerte is not inherently violent, Sylvia's interpretation twisted that faith into something dangerous. She believed that blood sacrifices would bring her power, wealth, and protection from harm. The victims were not strangers. They were people Sylvia knew, even loved, or claimed to love. The first was a 10-year-old boy, her own stepson. He lived under her roof and trusted her completely. The second, a 55-year-old woman, was a friend of the family who often visited the house. The third was a 24-year-old man, a distant relative, lured with the promise of food and shelter. Each of them had been chosen deliberately, selected not because the Cayman had wronged her, but because Sylvia believed their deaths would feed Santa Muerte and guarantee her family's safety and prosperity. Between 2009 and 2012, Sylvia's household descended into ritualistic violence. She didn't act alone. Her influence extended to her children and grandchildren, who she persuaded to participate in the killings. According to later testimonies, she told them that if they refused, Santa Muerte would punish them. The rituals followed a grim pattern. Victims were restrained and cut, their blood collected in cups and offered to a shrine decorated with candles, rosaries, and statues of the saint. Their bodies were then buried beneath the house. What made the case even more chilling was the apparent normalization of the acts within the family. Younger members, some barely teenagers, were ordered to watch, and in some cases, to help. Over time, the line between faith and fear blurred. To them, Sylvia was not just their matriarch. She was their spiritual leader. The family's crimes might have remained hidden if not for their growing carelessness. In early 2012, neighbors began noticing strange behavior, the smell of decay around the house, late-night chanting, and sudden disappearances of people connected to the family. The final victim, the 24-year-old man, had relatives who pressed authorities to investigate. When police questioned members of the household, contradictions in their stories quickly surfaced. Under pressure, one of Sylvia's daughters confessed. She described in disturbing detail how her mother orchestrated the killings, framing them as sacred duties. When police excavated the property, the evidence was undeniable. 3 bodies, ritual markings, and the blood-stained altar where offerings had been made. Sylvia's motive was rooted in a distorted mix of belief and control. Forensic psychologists later concluded that she exhibited traits of narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders. She used religion not as a source of comfort, but as a tool to dominate those around her. Her devotion to Santa Muerte was real, but it served her ambitions. She believed the sacrifices would grant her invincibility, and she took satisfaction in the power she held over her family. Her children, raised in an environment of fear, often described feeling both terrified of her and desperate for her approval. During her trial, Sylvia expressed no remorse. When asked why she did it, she reportedly said, "Santa Muerte required it. We had to obey." In 2020, after years of legal proceedings, Sylvia Morazz Moreno was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to a total of 180 years in prison. Her accomplices, including her children and grandchildren, some of whom were minors at the time of the crimes, received varying sentences depending on their roles. In prison, Sylvia reportedly continues to practice her faith. Guards describe her as calm, even friendly, but still unwavering in her belief that her actions were justified. For her, the killings were not crimes, they were offerings. The case of Sylvia Morazz Moreno forces an uncomfortable confrontation with how belief can be weaponized. Her story is not a condemnation of Santa Muerte itself, a faith practiced peacefully by millions, but of what happens when devotion becomes a mask for control and cruelty. For the people of Kazarene, the memory of that house lingers. It wasn't just the brutality of the acts that shocked them, but the betrayal of trust. A mother leading her own family into darkness, convincing them that taking lives was an act of protection. One investigator, standing outside the excavated home, said quietly, "Faith is supposed to give life meaning. Here, it was used to erase it." And perhaps that is the lasting weight of this story. That power, once mixed with fear and belief, can turn even the most intimate spaces, homes, families, into places where humanity is undone. Kazarene Gonzalez, Lamadrina of Chihuahua. On the evening of July 16, 2018, a call came into the Chihuahua City Police about a man found lifeless in a modest apartment complex. He was seated at a small kitchen table, a half-empty glass of liquor beside him. At first glance, it looked like a natural death. No signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of violence. But toxicology reports revealed something unusual, a lethal dose of sedatives mixed into his drink. This case was not isolated. Over the previous 2 years, similar deaths had been quietly accumulating, mostly men found in their homes or vehicles, each with the same chemical signature in their system. Investigators began to suspect a pattern, and when they followed the trail, it led to an unlikely suspect, a woman known in the city as Kazarene Gonzalez, nicknamed Lamadrina, the godmother. Flor didn't look like someone who would inspire fear. In her late 30s, she was stylish but understated, often seen in jeans and neat blouses, with her hair tied back in a practical bun. She presented herself as warm, approachable, and trustworthy. She cultivated a public image as someone people could rely on, a madrina in the cultural sense, a godmother figure, a protector, someone who helped those in need. She often befriended men who were new to the city or going through difficult times, offering companionship and comfort. To neighbors and acquaintances, Flor seemed generous, but in private, she had been carefully constructing a plan that turned that trust into her most effective weapon. Flor's victims were not random. They were chosen based on their vulnerabilities, men living alone, businessmen traveling frequently, or individuals with access to money but little family oversight. She befriended them, gained their confidence, and slowly inserted herself into their routines. Her method was deliberate. She would arrange casual meetings, sometimes romantic, sometimes platonic. She made herself indispensable, someone they felt they could relax around, and when they least expected it, she used that trust against them. Investigators later learned that she often spent weeks, even months, building these relationships before acting. This patience made her difficult to detect and, for a time, impossible to stop. Between 2016 and 2018, Flor perfected her method. She would visit her targets under the guise of a social call, sharing drinks or meals, and slip sedatives into their beverages. Once they were unconscious, she would rob them of cash, jewelry, and bank information. In many cases, she left the victims alive but heavily drugged. But something shifted in 2018. Perhaps it was carelessness, or perhaps, as prosecutors later argued, it was ambition. Flor began administering higher doses, ensuring her victims wouldn't wake up. This escalation coincided with the deaths that drew police attention. By July 2018, authorities believed she had killed at least 20 men. But proving it was difficult, many of the earlier deaths had been ruled accidental or natural, and forensic evidence was limited. The turning point came when a surviving victim, hospitalized after a near-fatal dose, identified Flor as the last person he had seen. With this testimony, investigators began reconstructing her movements. They discovered a pattern of withdrawals and transfers linked to her accounts, often occurring within hours of each victim's death. Security cameras placed her near multiple crime scenes, and forensic analysis tied her to the sedatives used. On August 3, 2018, Flor was arrested at a cafe in downtown Chihuahua. She was calm, even smiling, as officers led her away. In interviews, she denied wrongdoing, but offered explanations that shifted constantly, sometimes claiming self-defense, other times portraying herself as a victim of circumstance. What struck investigators most was her composure. One officer later said, "She acted like she was still in control, even after we took her away." Flor's motive appeared at first glance to be financial. She used the stolen money to fund a comfortable lifestyle, new clothes, vacations, and gifts for relatives. But psychologists who assessed her found something deeper, a pattern of manipulation rooted in power and control. She exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, marked by a lack of remorse and an ability to rationalize her actions. To her, these men were not individuals. They were opportunities, steps toward the life she believed she deserved. When asked in court if she regretted her actions, Flor reportedly said, "I gave them what they wanted. Company. They gave me what I needed. security. In 2020, Flor was convicted of 2 murders, the only cases prosecutors could definitively link to her through evidence, and sentenced to 50 years for each count, along with additional time for robbery and fraud, bringing her total sentence close to 100 years. Authorities, however, suspect she may have been responsible for as many as 25 deaths. In prison, Flor has maintained a low profile. Unlike other high-profile offenders, she does not grant interviews or seek publicity. Guards describe her as meticulous, spending hours writing letters and keeping detailed journals, though no one knows what she records in them. The story of Lamadrina unsettles because it challenges assumptions about danger. Her method was quiet, almost invisible. No dramatic confrontations, no public displays of violence. She weaponized trust, turning simple gestures of warmth into tools of destruction. For the families of her victims, the betrayal runs deeper than the financial loss or even the lives taken. Many believe Flor truly cared for their loved ones. Some still struggle to reconcile the image of the kind, attentive woman they met with the reality of what she did. One investigator, reflecting on the case, said, "She didn't just take lives, she took the idea that kindness is safe." And perhaps that is the haunting truth of her story. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and tells you it's here to help. Itzel Nayeli Garcia Montaño, La Degolladora de Chimalhuacán. On the night of September 23, 2015, panic spread through the streets of Chimalhuacán, a densely populated municipality on the outskirts of Mexico City. A man had been found collapsed near a bus stop, his throat slashed so deeply that passers-by thought he had been attacked by a gang. Before authorities could process that scene, reports of another stabbing emerged less than a kilometer away, then another. By the end of the spree, 7 people, ordinary residents going about their routines, had been targeted. 2 were dead. The others were critically injured but alive, left to describe an assailant that shocked investigators. Not a man, not a group, but a 20-year-old woman wielding a knife. Her name was Itzel Nayeli Garcia Montaño, and the press would soon call her La Degolladora de Chimalhuacán, the slasher of Chimalhuacán. Itzel didn't resemble the kind of figure typically associated with such violence. Slim, barely over 5 feet tall, and often dressed in casual jeans and sweatshirts, she blended into the background of her working-class neighborhood. Neighbors described her as quiet but erratic, sometimes friendly, other times withdrawn and easily agitated. Her family background was fractured. Raised in an environment marked by poverty and instability, she struggled with substance use from her teenage years. By 17, she had developed a dependence on inhalants, substances that can produce hallucinations and aggressive impulses when abused. Despite these issues, Itzel was not known for violent behavior before 2015. Those who knew her said she carried an undercurrent of anger, but rarely acted on it. That changed in September, when a domestic dispute seemed to push her over an edge she could not return from. There was no relationship. That was part of what made the attack so terrifying. The victims included. Authorities acted quickly. Using security cameras, they traced her movements through the city and identified her by distinctive features noted by survivors. Her hair tied into a loose ponytail, a small scar on her left cheek. 3 days after the attacks, police surrounded the house where she was hiding. When they entered, they found her lying on the floor, clutching a half-empty can of inhalant. She did not resist arrest. According to officers, her first words were not of apology or fear, but confusion. Did they die? During questioning, Itzel provided chillingly matter-of-fact details. She admitted to the stabbings, describing them as impulsive acts fueled by anger and chemicals. "I didn't think about it," she said. "I just wanted to hurt someone." Psychological evaluations revealed a layered picture. Itzel showed signs of mental instability, possibly rooted in a mood disorder compounded by chronic substance abuse. Experts noted that inhalant use can trigger violent outbursts and distort perception, particularly in individuals already experiencing emotional distress. But there was also a deeper current of resentment. She spoke about feeling invisible, about years of humiliation and anger toward those she believed looked down on her. Her domestic fight that day, she said, lit the fuse. While her actions seemed frenzied, investigators argued they were not entirely detached from intent. She chose a weapon, targeted the most vulnerable individuals she encountered, and returned home as though completing a grim ritual. This combination of randomness and control made her case particularly difficult to categorize. In 2017, Itzel was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder in connection with the surviving victims. Her trial for the two murders was still pending at the time of sentencing, delayed by procedural complications and psychiatric evaluations. In court, she appeared subdued, often staring at the floor. She did not offer an apology, though at one point she murmured, "I didn't want to do it, but it happened." Whether this was remorse or simply a statement of fact remained unclear. In prison, she has been placed under psychiatric supervision. Reports suggest she oscillates between periods of calm lucidity and episodes of agitation, particularly when denied access to substances she had once relied on. The case of La Degoladora de Chimalhuacan unsettles because it feels both chaotic and deliberate. It raises uncomfortable questions about how violence emerges, not always from calculated malice, but sometimes from fractured minds colliding with volatile circumstances. For the people of Chimalhuacan, those 2 hours in September left scars that extend beyond the victims and their families. Random violence erodes a sense of safety. It teaches people to look over their shoulders, even in their own neighborhoods. One investigator, reflecting on the case, said quietly, "She didn't know them, and they didn't know her. That's what makes it so hard to understand. You can protect yourself from someone who hates you. But how do you protect yourself from someone who doesn't even care who you are?" And perhaps that is the lasting weight of this story, that sometimes danger doesn't come from enemies or plans. It comes from the collision of rage, instability, and opportunity, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between ordinary life and sudden horror can be. Melissa Calderon, La China. On the morning of September 18, 2015, residents of La Paz, Baja California Sur, woke to the sound of gunfire echoing through narrow streets. It was not unusual. This city, once a quiet coastal destination, had become a battlefield in Mexico's drug war. But what set this incident apart was not the number of victims nor the brutality of the ambush. It was the name whispered by investigators as they arrived at the scene, Melissa Calderon Ojeda, better known as La China. By then, Melissa wasn't just another figure in the Sinaloa cartel. She had become one of its most feared operatives, a woman accused of orchestrating over 150 killings, commanding a unit so ruthless it earned its own name, Las Fuerzas Especiales de los Damaso. And unlike many who rose and fell quickly in cartel ranks, Melissa's story didn't begin with power. It began with something far more ordinary. Publicly, Melissa once looked like anyone else in Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa. Born in the early 1980s, she grew up in a working-class family. Photos from her teenage years show a shy girl with long dark hair, someone who might have aspired to a modest life. Friends from her youth recall her as ambitious, fiercely protective of those she cared about, but quick to anger when disrespected. By her early 20s, Melissa was dating a man connected to the Sinaloa cartel, and through him she was introduced to the inner workings of organized crime. At first, she handled small tasks, moving money, delivering messages, managing safe houses. But Melissa was observant. She studied how power moved through the cartel, how loyalty was built and broken, and how fear could be more effective than trust. What made her stand out was not just her willingness to be violent, it was her ability to be strategic. For Melissa, victims were rarely personal. Most were soldiers in rival groups, smaller, full-time dealers who disobeyed orders, or civilians caught in the web of cartel politics. But there were exceptions, people who crossed her directly, betraying her or questioning her authority. Those who worked under her said she remembered every slight, no matter how small. One former associate, now in witness protection, described her as calm until she wasn't. He said, "If she smiled while talking about you, that was worse than if she shouted. It meant she already decided what she was going to do." This ability to blend personal vendetta with cartel discipline made her both respected and feared. By the late 2000s, Melissa had become a trusted enforcer for the Damaso faction of the Sinaloa cartel, led by Damaso Lopez Núñez, a close ally of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. She formed her own unit, Las Fuerzas Especiales de los Damaso, an all-female squad trained to carry out high-profile assassinations. Their operations were precise. Targets were tracked for weeks before attacks. Ambushes were staged in public spaces, designed to send messages as much as to eliminate enemies. Witnesses often described the attackers as disciplined, moving with military efficiency. Melissa herself rarely appeared at these scenes, but her presence was felt in every decision. She chose who lived and who died, often with a cold logic that blurred moral boundaries. By 2014, authorities estimated her group had been involved in more than 150 killings across Baja California Sur and Sinaloa. Power, however, is fragile in the world Melissa inhabited. In 2015, tensions between factions of the Sinaloa cartel began to fracture alliances. Melissa, once protected by her loyalty to the Damaso faction, found herself targeted by rivals within her own organization. Her downfall began with a betrayal. According to investigators, a member of her inner circle provided intelligence to authorities, leading to her arrest in September 2015. At the time of her capture, she was traveling with her boyfriend, another high-ranking cartel operative. They carried weapons, cash, and communications equipment, evidence that tied her to multiple homicides. Yet even in custody, Melissa refused to cooperate. Witnesses at her arraignment described her as composed, almost detached, as prosecutors listed the crimes attributed to her. What drove Melissa Calderón? Prosecutors argued it was power and money, but those who studied her case suggested something more layered. Melissa seemed to crave control, not just over her enemies, but over her own narrative. In a world dominated by men, she carved out a space where her gender became an advantage. People underestimated her, and she used that to strike harder, faster, and with more precision. Psychologists who reviewed her behavior noted traits of antisocial personality disorder, a lack of remorse, a capacity for manipulation, and an ability to compartmentalize violence. Yet she also showed remarkable discipline, capable of long-term planning that many of her male counterparts lacked. One investigator put it bluntly: she wasn't chaotic, she was deliberate, and that made her more dangerous. Melissa's arrest in 2015 was celebrated by Mexican authorities as a major victory. She was charged with multiple counts of organized crime and homicide. But in the years that followed, rumors persisted that she continued to influence cartel operations from behind bars, either through intermediaries or by leveraging alliances forged before her capture. Some reports suggest she may still hold sway in Baja California Sur, her name invoked by new operatives as a symbol of fear and authority. Whether these claims are exaggerated or real, they reflect a truth about her legacy. Melissa Calderón became more than a person. She became an idea, a reminder that power in the drug war can take many forms, and that violence has no single face. The story of La China forces us to confront an unsettling reality. We often expect figures of such notoriety to fit certain molds, driven by desperation or consumed by rage. Melissa complicates that picture. Her violence was not random. It was calculated, built on ambition, and shaped by an environment where brutality was rewarded. For investigators who pursued her, the case left lingering questions. Was she a product of her world or someone who chose to exploit it? One detective, reflecting on her capture, said quietly, "You look at her, and you want to see a monster. But she's just a person, and maybe that's worse. Because if she's just a person, it means anyone could become what she became." And perhaps that is the haunting truth of Melissa Calderón, that power once tasted rarely lets go, and those who master it leave behind echoes that do not fade, even after the gunfire stops. These stories leave us with a heavy truth. Behind every headline is a life taken, lives shattered, and choices that can never be undone. From cult leaders to calculated assassins, from fractured minds to those who thrived on power, each case forces us to ask what truly drives someone to cross that final line. Which of these stories struck you the most? Do you think motives explain the actions, or do they only make them harder to comprehend? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and your perspective helps keep these conversations alive. If you found this deep dive compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We explore true stories like these every week, and your support helps bring more of them to light.